I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up for the recently ended Get Graphic Readathon. The Get Graphic Readathon had 4 hosts, and I will link the 4 of them below, as well as the official Twitter thread. As the name implies, this readathon was dedicated to a weekend of reading comics material. So the first thing that I read for this event was Tillie Walden's Spinning, which is a memoir about primarily her time as a competitive figure skater in the synchronized skating field. What I guess you would call mid-level competitive, because she was in teams that were comprised of kids who knew they were probably not making the Olympics, but who were still competing at a fairly reasonable level. She does a great job of portraying movement, which can be tricky to do, especially when it's such specific movement in terms of figure skating moves. And I found that element to be probably the most impressive element of this. About 10 years ago, I had a coworker whose daughter was in synchronized skating, and I think that daughter is now about the same age that Tillie Walden is now. So I both felt really intrigued because at the time, before I worked with this woman, I had never heard of synchronized skating. I was, familiar with figure skating, obviously, but synchronized skating had been completely new to me. So it was interesting for me to see this behind-the-scenes version from someone who was the same age as my coworker's daughter. As a memoir, this wasn't super well structured. The opening and closing scenes are framed as Tillie going back into skating after years away. And if this had been written by an author who was talking about their youth from a greater distance, who was, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years away from it, I think that that's a structure that works quite well. But because the author is only 21 right now, and was presumably 20 when she wrote this, at that point she'd been barely 2 years out of competitive skating. So this idea that after years away seems a little silly, because it's not years away, it's a couple of years. And also because there hasn't been that gap, there isn't a lot of reflection on what any of this means. So there are a number of points in the book. For example, she talks about how her parents, who paid all kinds of money for her to go to private figure skating lessons and to be part of these synchronized skating teams, didn't go to her competitive events or her testing sessions. And it's mentioned that that's unusual, but there's no real exploration of that. It's very, here it is, and now we're not going to talk about that ever again. And there were a number of bits in here that were like that. She talks a few points about being bullied by certain people on teams, and then that disappears. Early on in this, the family moves from New Jersey to Texas, and of course that's a big culture difference and a big shift. She talks a little bit about how the skating terminology is different, which I thought was really interesting. But aside from that, there wasn't much discussion about what that meant for her or for the family. There's a somewhat more major plot point where she's going through a first romantic relationship at 14, and the other girl's mother finds out about them and forbids them to see each other again. And because that happens, she decides to come out to her family and her friends. And she makes a comment that people are mostly superficially accepting, but that there's still a lot of homophobia in the culture. But none of that is dug into. We're told that that happens. And we're told that she tells her friends, although prior to that we've been told that she didn't really have friends, so it's a weird scene. And again, it doesn't really come up again. It feels weird to talk about a graphic memoir and call it guilty of telling rather than showing, but on basically everything that wasn't directly related to skating, that was what I felt here. So I definitely feel like I learned a lot about synchronized skating, and I was glad I read it because I've been curious about synchronized skating. But I definitely think that this is a book that, while it's beautifully illustrated and I really like the way she drew it, I felt like the writing would have been better served if she had marinated on this for a little while longer. So after that, I went for an entirely different genre, and I read Royal Blood, which is by Alejandro Jodorowsky and Dongzi. This is just a beautiful book. The art in this is just absolutely stunning. This was originally published in French as 3 separate volumes. The English translation here compiles them all into a single book. It is very loosely about a king whose throne is stolen from him and then he steals it back, and it's a fantasy that feels both like a very traditional European royalty power fantasy with a sort of grimdark wrapping. So this is definitely a book with gratuitously unpleasant violence and violent sexuality and weird relationships, plus some magic and wolves. Story-wise, I'd call this good enough. I felt like what was happening was that we were getting a standard story and that the writing was just injecting just enough weirdness and just enough violence into it to make it something different than the standard, but it still felt extremely standard. That said, I did think the art was just fantastic. So, pretty to look at, and definitely a story that is paced well and moves along nicely, but if you're looking for something new and exciting, this is not particularly that. After that, I read volumes 2 through 4 of Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips's Fatale, which is this kind of Cthulhu crime noir story with an ageless woman who shows up at various points and men getting in trouble. The first volume had 2 main stories, and I really liked that. I thought it was going interesting places, and I was super impressed with the tightness of the storytelling and the way they blended together. As the books go on, I didn't feel like it fit together as well. We end up getting more and more stories from more and more points in time. The second volume is actually entirely about past lives of our femme fatale, Jo, and it's one of these things where this could be very interesting. This goes back further in history, whereas the main books are all basically the 20th and 21st centuries, whereas this goes back, we're in medieval times, we're in various other points. I didn't feel like it worked as well. The art style that Sean Phillips uses is very much that noir style, and when you set that any time before the 1930s, it's odd, because I think we have cultural expectations for that, which is you can tell a noir story from the 30s and onwards, but when you set it earlier, it's interesting, and it's kind of interesting to see what a medieval noir would be like, or what a Wild West noir would be like, but there isn't enough variety in the art to tie it all together, which is almost funny because I think sometimes different art styles break up the flow, but in this case I really felt like we needed a different art style to separate the different stories from each other. And honestly, by the time we got to the final volume and we were looking at this 1990s grunge scene interspersed with the modern main character, we had been separated from the main male character at that point for so long that I kind of stopped caring about his story. It was definitely interesting to look at how this immortal femme fatale is affecting these men throughout history, but at the same time, if the modern story is the one that's tying it all together, which it is because that's the one that flows through volumes 1, 2, and 4, it kind of got lost in the narrative sludge. I still think this is a very atmospheric series. I still love Brubaker's crime writing. I think he's great. The one complaint that I'd had about the first volume about Sean Phillips's art was that the main male character in the modern day story is an amputee, and he'd drawn the socket of his prosthesis in a way that didn't look like a socket, but he has fixed that in these ones, so. But considering that that's like 3 panels in this 4 volumes, that really shouldn't be the thing that stands out to me. I would say that this series is definitely good enough, but I really felt like the first one was promising something new and different, and that it didn't quite live up to the promise. Still entertaining enough. So after that, I decided I would go back to one of my standby series, and I picked up Hellblazer Joyride, which is a collection of Andy Diggle's run on Hellblazer. It's great, it does a lot of disturbing things, it plays with imagery, it is very much that kind of psychological and supernatural horror that Hellblazer really was good at presenting under various authors. And when I talk about how I miss the old version of John Constantine, which I said in one of my last videos I was giving up on pronouncing it that way, because in the TV series they say it the other way. But no, in this one he actually says rhymes with fine at one point, so there you go. So maybe we should say the Vertigo version is pronounced that way, and the newer DC version is pronounced the TV way. I don't know. In any case, this has a lot of decaying bodies, and magic, ghosts, and body horror type stuff, which is not going to be to everyone's taste, but I thought this was great stuff. I had been assuming that this would be a reread for me, but I had actually only read one of the stories in this before and not the other, so. And then finally the last book that I read for this was Fred Chao's Johnny Hiro. Half Asian, all hero is the subheading. This is a funny book. It tells a number of stories about this main character, Johnny Hiro, and his girlfriend, who live in Brooklyn and are struggling to make ends meet. And in between working their normal jobs, he's a busboy in a restaurant who's hoping to become a chef, and she has some kind of office insurance-y type job. So they're living out what superficially are normal problems in actual New York. And then a dinosaur shows up who's frustrated that he didn't get to be Godzilla. And they call up Mayor Bloomberg, and he shows up. They go to court for destroying their apartment, and Judge Judy is presiding. Or he goes fishing with his boss, and they catch the world's largest whale-sized tuna. It's just a funny combination of real-life, quarter-life crisis-type drama mixed with this over-the-top, I was going to say surrealist. The back of the book says absurdist, which probably is the better terminology. They go to the opera and are attacked by samurai. It is a funny book. The art is cute. The art is a little bit busy for my tastes, especially in the first story. I found it a little bit distracting, but it actually became cleaner and cleaner as it went along. So I know there are more books in this series. Actually, during Book Outlet's Booktoberfest sale, I picked up the second book in the series for less than $2. So I'll be curious to read that soon. Yeah, so that was what I ended up reading. I had one book on my TBR that I didn't get around to, which was the one that was fulfilling the recommendations challenge. So I didn't hit that challenge, but I did hit the other ones because they were black and white art, with which this is, also a new series, which this is, multiples in a series, which this is, a book of a certain length, which this one was. Yeah, so overall that was a lot of fun. I do read quite a lot of comic material, but not usually all at once like that. So this was kind of an interesting mix-up of my usual patterns for reading. So thank you to the 4 people who were hosting that. So if you were doing the Get Graphic Readathon, what did you read? Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.